Start recording. Casey, you're going to record too on to the cloud?
Yes.
Great. Okay, we're recording.
Has it started?
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, welcome. I'm Jim Shields, and I'm president of the UN Association, the Palm Beach chapter. And tonight, we're going to present the fourth in our series on global affairs. And our speaker is Dr. Johanna Mendelson Forman, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and in the area of managing across boundaries initiative is where she focuses. She's also a professor in the School of International Affairs at American University, and formerly had been a director of security and human rights at the United States, as well as an advisor to the UN mission in Haiti. And one of her more recent activities was producing a podcast on the kitchen, the new venue of foreign policy. She's a distinguished scholar and very deeply involved in food activities related to conflict around the world. And when I asked her what she might focus on, she said she would focus on 3 C's: conflict, climate, and COVID, as well as cuisine, of course, a fourth, food. And it's a most timely program. And we're very excited that she is participating in our series. And Dr. Forman, it's yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Jim, for having me. Before I begin this presentation, I just want to offer you a special thanks. You're one of the most determined people I've ever met. We've had conversations, we've had calls, you've encouraged me with outreach. And I want to add a special thanks to all the board members of the Palm Beach chapter of the United Nations Association. Even if I can't be with you in person tonight, I'm deeply honored to be with you virtually this evening. And I finally want to offer a special thank you to Sarah Stimson, who suggested that I speak to your organization. I met Sarah over a year ago, and she has remained a friend and supporter. So if she's on the line, I just want to say many thanks. But let's begin, because we don't have a lot of time tonight. Just over a year ago, I was scheduled to speak. I was looking at the slides I had produced, and I was looking forward to meeting all of you and forward to meeting in person, and then heading to Lima, Peru. And of course, the rest is history. I had to cancel both trips as we watched in shock as the world closed down. By March 11th, the COVID pandemic had arrived, and the magnitude of its impact was yet unknown. And I recall thinking to myself as I listened to the head of the World Health Organization announce that the COVID virus had now reached the pandemic level. My immediate thoughts told me that that was really bad news. It meant that borders were closing. We'd have no travel, no visiting families, no holidays. The Stimson Center went on remote, and so did the universities. We all have probably lost friends and families, and we're still waiting for an all clear. And that we are talking today at all through Zoom technology is a small miracle. That we are gathered to talk about food security this evening is also important, because like everything else that happened in the last year, food insecurity was affected by disease, making global conditions even more dire. So I'm going to start sharing my screen if I can. I think this is it. Share. Give me 1 second. Let me hold on. Slideshow from the beginning. Is it working? Yes. So as we reflect on the past year of political turmoil, of dramatic recovery, production of vaccines, we are witnessing what one of my podcast companions calls the exponential era, where changes are happening at unprecedented speeds. There are new technologies that bring both opportunities to prevent disease, and in the case of COVID, we have a vaccine, and they also carry new threats, like the inability to stop the acceleration of climate change. So let me go to my next slide. So we are living in what is now the UN Development Report so well called it, the next frontier, the Anthropocene. This report, which was released at the end of the last year, said that we humans have caused exponential change. And the report demonstrates that since 1945, we have achieved not only remarkable growth, we've lifted so many people out of poverty, but we've done this at a great cost to nature. We have pursued an economic model, for example, of development that's based on unsustainable production and consumption, and heedless of the impact on the natural world in which we are inextricably embedded. And the bill is now coming due. This slide that I have is just some bullet points, how we went from the Holocene, which has lasted 12,000 years, to the Anthropocene, which is an age where humans are affecting the climate. There's no need to dwell on this, but just to take a look at the impact we're having on carbon emissions and how rich countries, of course, are the greatest emitters, poorer countries, having a lesser impact, but still something to consider. So you're all, as UNA people, familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I don't think I need to review what they are, but ending hunger, which is SDG 2, and ending global poverty are no longer within reach. That's the sad consequences of all this pandemic. After decades of progress, conflicts in the pandemic have made this planet experience more hunger and more disease. At the end of last year, at least 34 million more people faced possible famine in 2021. That was the conclusion of something called the State of Food Insecurity, or SOFI. Many of you may have seen this if you do any work with the UN, but the publication of this report was very clear. It said the world is not on track to achieve zero hunger by 2030. If recent trends continue, the number of people affected by hunger will surpass the 840 million by 2030, which is about 9.8, almost 10% of the global population. So, as Jim said in his introduction, this is all about what I call the 3 C's. This is not original to me. It was also stated by David Beasley, but we have this toxic brew of conflict, climate change, and now COVID-19. And we need to examine the impact of all 3 on food security. So let's begin with global conflict. But I want to do one aside. For those of you, we use the term food security sort of loosely, but in fact, food security is about 4 different things. It's about the availability of food, the accessibility of food, the affordability of food, and the desirability of food. And you have to have all of these 4 operating together to transform a food system. Now, about 40% of the world's population, that's about 3.5 billion people, cannot afford a healthy diet. And what's interesting is that while I don't want to go into a discourse about food security, most people in the world can't eat food of high nutritional quality. They eat a lot of rice, corn, wheat, but they eat few fruits and vegetables. So what your parents were telling you about eating your vegetables and what you tell your kids is true. Most people live, the cost of a healthy, nutritious meal, according to the UN World Food Program, Food and Agriculture Organization, is $3.75 a day in US dollars. The international poverty line is $1.90. So this is what one meal a day looks like to someone on Lake Chad. Not much food at all. And I think these are very provocative photos because when you think about it, $1.90 is not much to have a meal on. And this is the basis of food insecurity. Most countries in the world trade, and out of the 195 countries in the world, at least 34, 5 in Asia and 29 in Africa, are unable to produce their own food due to land or water limitations. So these are also countries that are conflict affected. So let's move on to food and conflict, because that's what I was told I needed to talk about tonight. And when it comes to conflict is really a great disruptor. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen man-made conflicts that have plagued, very few countries, but they've really been in the headlines. Syria, Yemen, Haiti, South Sudan, Ethiopia. If you look at this chart from the World Food Program's 2020 food crisis, and you go along the line, we hear a lot about Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, Sudan, and I think the last one I can see with my slide is covering is Haiti. This is really where most of the world's hungry people live. And it's not changing. That's what's so sad about this kind of a chart. These countries that are listed here, fragile and conflict affected situations, this is the World Bank list. I'm sorry we didn't put a footnote on it. This is the 2020 list. These are sometimes called low-income countries under stress, but in fact, they've come up with this fragile and conflict-afflicted situation. There are about 36 of these countries, and these are the countries that are the ones that are always on watch lists, countries that have really serious, not only political problems, economic problems, but they have famine. And what's interesting is among these countries, they're home to 60% of the world's hungriest people. And in this group, about 122 million of the 155 million stunted children live there in these places. And that is the problem. Ongoing wars, some waged by governments, some by irregular fighters, they wreak havoc on the life of civilians. So when you have a conflict, one of the most obvious things that happens, and this is a great slide by Mercy Corps, is you have a really serious impact on agriculture. So this is a normal food cycle. On the top line, people plant, they have rainy seasons, the crop grows, they harvest, and then they take their seeds and they prepare for the next season. But that doesn't happen during a war. When you have a war, you have irregular forces. You can have violence during a planting season. You don't get to plant crops. There's no harvest, and food runs out. And this is what happens when you have a conflict. There's also a strong connection, which has been established by some excellent research done by the World Food Program and the United Nations, on the link between hunger and instability. So if you look at this chart, you can see, first of all, on my right side, I guess your right side also, that food insecurity drives instability, and it's a loop, it's a feedback loop. And the drivers are very, straightforward. There's resource competition, market failure, weather problems, greed, grievance, but all of these factors create the connection between hunger and food instability. So even when you can't harvest and you have no money, you can't buy any food for your family. Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently mentioned that in Ethiopia, which tragically received the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago, the Tigray province, which has been the center of fighting now for over a year, has seen an increase of starving people going from 1 to 3 million between November of 2020 and February 2021. And this rapid deterioration of one province is an example of how internal conflict creates this kind of tragedy. Now, 2.5 years ago, the Security Council sounded an alarm about the link between food and conflict, and they passed a resolution 2417, which mandated the Council to be informed of the link between conflict-induced widespread food insecurity and member states of the UN, which had already recognized how important the link between food and security was around the world. This year, the Security Council took up the resolution again in relationship to two countries on the brink of starvation, Syria and Yemen. What the Security Council can do is difficult, but the fact that they have recognized this as an important relationship cannot be underestimated in terms of calling awareness to war and fighting and food. So I would be remiss if I didn't point out also that this link between food and conflict was the reason behind the UN World Food Program receiving the 2020 World Prize. Here's David Beasley, who is the former governor of South Carolina, and he stated that the world stood on the brink of, hunger pandemic with, he said, conflict, climate change, and COVID are all pushing 270 million more people to the brink of starvation. So there's a happy David Beasley taking the award, but it's actually another example of how the UN has had to upscale to its biggest upscale in history of feeding people in 50 countries now. And they certainly do not have enough money based on appeals to do this. Plus, with the COVID lockdown, Beasley has said that now the UN World Food Program is also doing feeding in schools, something it hadn't done before. Let me move on quickly to food as a weapon of war, because sometimes you don't think about it, but even before the pandemic, we had the use of use of food by authoritarian governments to become a weapon. It's certainly the cheapest weapon of war. And here's a picture of people in Venezuela, one of the countries mentioned. You can't study when you're hungry, you don't get any results. But the tactic, as I say, in the 21st century has become a popular methodology. And so, for example, I want to show you this slide. In Syria, this was from 2012, but it continues. One of the things that President Assad did very successfully to subdue enemy factions of the regime was to bomb bakeries. In the Middle East, bread is central to every meal, and people go to the bakery 3 times a day. And this was a chart that McClatchy newspapers put together, but it shows how many places the Syrian Air Force had bombed bakeries. And it's a tragic thing because the people who are getting killed are not insurgents. They are women and children, men and women who come to the bakery to get their food. And this has been well documented. Another place that we have also seen this kind of tragedy based on a blockade is in Yemen. Yemen is now the worst place in the world in terms of food shortage, and the inability for people to find employment there makes it even worse. There are no jobs. Food had entered the country, but there's no distribution system because of the rebels that are fighting there. And Yemen is forcing a new legal debate about what it means to have food as a crime of war. We know that in Syria, Assad is being brought up on charges for war crimes because the Geneva Conventions makes withholding of food from civilian populations, also by the way of soldiers and prisoners of war, a crime. But Yemen is a very strange situation because people debate whether it's economic or not. But if you take one look at the starving people in that country, you see that this is indeed a war crime. I'm not going to go into many other examples like the Democratic Republic, which the World Food Program says is poised to be the next largest hunger emergency, or Afghanistan, which still faces that, or Iraq. But as I think we were talking to Jim earlier, the World Food Program has asked for $5.5 billion in new money. And that is something that takes one's breath away. And similarly, in Venezuela, a country that was never food starved, it was held up, as a place where democratic governments held for years when other parts of Latin America was in crisis with authoritarian governments, is now one of the hungriest places in the world. And I don't want to go into that. It's the subject of a whole separate lecture. So let me get to the second C, climate, which we're talking about as well. And I've always been interested in what the Swedish diplomat and former UN Deputy Secretary General said. He made this observation when he said he was at a conference called the EAT Forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the EAT Forum, it's like the World Economic Forum for food. And he said, before we talk about changing food systems, we really have to make peace with nature. And it was a very profound observation because, in fact, it was the first call to prevention of the further risk to our planet to ensure that future generations would have adequate and healthy food. And I do think then I saw Antonio Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, use this term. And it doesn't matter who adopts it. It's a very important thing that you cannot talk about food security unless you are talking about climate. And whether it's reducing food or seeking more sustainable ways to grow it, we have to use fewer animal products. We have to reduce food waste. And this is just a table about 1/3 of food produced in the world for human consumption a year. Approximately 1.3 billion tons gets lost or wasted. This is a chart which shows countries that waste as much food. And it's clear that the industrialized countries do more than the non-industrialized countries. But one interesting factoid about food waste, there's a very interesting project in the United States called Project Drawdown. And in that project, when they were talking about landfills, which is where food waste goes, if landfill were a country, it would be the 3rd largest carbon emitter in the world. So you have to think about what you throw in the trash and what country people are throwing away, because it all impacts the way we are going to survive. Now, we're well aware of the rising temperatures and sea levels. For those of you in Florida, you certainly are aware of it. And one of the other things that happens with rising sea levels is you get migration. And this is a picture from the summer of the Honduran caravan that was marching towards Mexico. And I put this up here because climate migration is something that is understudied, and also people are surprised when it happens. But certainly many of these people from Honduras are victims of violence, there's no question, but the world is full of climate migrants, and this phenomena is not going to stop. And we really do need to understand what we can do to mitigate this, because if not, we will continue to have people traveling from areas where the land cannot be cultivated because of climate change. Another interesting phenomena, and it was written up by a wonderful journalist who studied Syria and compared it to California, is that Syria, when the war started, was also seriously impacted by a drought. And one of the things that happened is if you were a rich farmer in Syria, you could dig wells. But the water table, as you know, in that part of the world is very, very deep. And if you couldn't afford to dig a well, many farmers gave up and moved into urban areas. And the uprisings in Damascus that took place in 2011 are clearly related to those people who came into the urban centers, could not find work, and then started to get agitated against the Assad regime. So there are all these connections between food, climate, and conflict. Let me briefly go into COVID, something we hear every single day, every single hour of our life. But the pandemic has not avoided the global south. There is a strong connection between rising temperatures on this planet and the possibility for zoonotic diseases. We're all old enough to remember the Ebola epidemic that happened before in the 21st century in Central Africa and in the West Africa. And many of us know about the swine flu, the H1N1 flu in Mexico. We may be getting ahead of this pandemic, but rest assured that in our lifetimes, we are still going to see more pandemics. So last September, the Security Council warned that food insecurity would double as a result of COVID. And some council members called for a ceasefire to be imposed in all conflict zones as a way of mitigating further spread of COVID. As we can tell, this is not necessarily what happened. And even before the global pandemic was on the rise, large numbers of hungry people in the world increased by 10 million. And with COVID, the estimate is that between 83 and 132 million more people will become undernourished due to the pandemic, which is very troubling. So as we see, progress stalls in the COVID-19 pandemic is intensifying vulnerabilities, and all activities, processing, affecting production, consumption are impacted by COVID. While I think it's too early to assess the impact of these lockdowns, what I think is true and what the FAO said, the Food and Agricultural Organization said, is that we will not reach the global sustainable development goals by 2030. Now, if history provides any lessons, the uncertainty that a pandemic has created some governments to resolve conflicts, let's hope that this is going to be the case. There has been some movement, believe it or not, in Venezuela, and there may be movement elsewhere as people want to resolve conflicts to get COVID under control. But I am not holding my breath. So let's just talk before I close up on America, because we can't underestimate that food insecurity in this country is real. This slide shows people picking up food at a food bank in San Antonio, Texas. This is a picture that took place and is an ongoing scene. But we do know, according to what the statistics are, that hunger in America exists for 50 million people, and that's up by more than 15 million from the prior year. That's 1 in 6 in the US population, including
I really consider that
1 in 5 children. Food bank networks say that more than 37 million more Americans each year are now using food banks, and that includes 14 million children and 3 million seniors. That's a 50% increase since last year, and even greater than the financial crisis in 2007. And the numbers will continue to go up, because even as people get vaccinated and the economy opens up, we know jobs are not going to reappear, and the dependence on assistance will be something we all face. We don't expect our country to, erupt in a conflict. We're not Syria, we're not Afghanistan. But I just want to say one last thing, that in 2015, the National Intelligence Council, which is part of the CIA, issued a report and stated that food security was a national security issue. Now, this doesn't sound like a major statement, but it indeed was important, because what it did was it pointed to the kinds of conflicts that I've mentioned earlier as places that were vulnerable, places where the United States may be called in, or the UN together with the United States may be called in to operate and try and quell conflict. So what the pandemic also did was showed how fragile our global supply chains were. And I'm not talking about shortages of toilet paper, but no country is independent of a global supply chain anymore. And when we start trying to rely on local producers, we see how we are not always able to get everything we need at the same time. But I was told I shouldn't end this on such a sad note, because the story is sad, and these are some food trend projections, which are not happy pictures. You can see the overall food insecurity rate and the child rate, but I'm going to go to ways we can mitigate this. One of the things that comes out of COVID, I think is very interesting, is the activism of chefs to try and help with hunger. This is really a positive feature, in spite of the fact that 20 million people in this country have lost a job in the food industry. All of you, I'm sure, have seen Jose Andres' face on TV with World Central Kitchen, but he's not the only activist. There was $28 billion in the American Recovery Act for food groups and opening restaurants, and the getting chefs out of the kitchen and onto the barricades, as I say, is a very important role in raising the awareness of food security and hunger. The book on the right, Feed the Resistance by Julia Turshen, who is a well-known chef and an activist, actually documents recipes, simple recipes you can make when you're protesting. And she traces the kinds of foods back to the civil rights movement and how food was centered to that civil rights movement in organizing. But I think even in these darkest days, the United States comes together with the United Nations as a force for good. I've always been a believer that, we do better together than alone. I've always thought the United Nations could work on food insecurity. Many people, for example, don't know that the World Food Program and the Food and Agricultural Organization belong to the United Nations or are part of it, or that the World Health Organization, which works on global pandemics, except probably now they do, that it's been vilified, is a part of that international system. But I just think that there is hope for the future. There are chefs who are working on the Chef's Manifesto to advocate the SDG 2. They have a manifesto with all their lists of things they do. There are more than 1,000 chefs who signed up to implement the Global Development Goals. So things are not as sad, and these are the principles of the manifesto. There are chefs from all around the world. They travel, they talk, they go to conferences, and mainly they teach about using more sustainable products and using more local products. So if you don't know about this, take a look at them. They're quite an interesting group of people. So I could say many more things, but I've said to Jim it's 5:30, and I wanted to take all your questions and be available to you. And I hope that what you have found to be interesting in addressing the topic and not too depressing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me and be ready to take everybody's questions. Jim, is that okay? You're muted, Jim. Okay.
Yep, perfect. What a wonderful presentation, very inspiring, very sad, but some hope in there. And why don't you take over and if you have just chair the question period. I'm sure there are some good questions. I could start with one, but let's see if someone
Throw them at me.
listens.
Throw them at me. And I don't know, you're not going to use the hand raising function. So if I can see you, some people screens are dark, but you can shout out the question and just tell me your name and I'll be happy to answer it.
Hi, this is Eileen Davis Jerome, Southeast Regional Rep for UNA USA. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Forman, for this fantastic presentation linking food insecurity to pandemics and bridging inequalities globally. It is so important. I'm looking at your ties with the mission in Haiti and having a lot of contact with the people of Haiti, and also being the immediate past president of the Broward County chapter, your neighbor. I happen to be on a Wafuna call with the current US representative to the Security Council. My question on Haiti, I wasn't able to get through, but in view of the issues and the problems happening there, always with food insecurities, and now with the situation in the streets with a president that was not the people's choice and has been supported by the US and the UN, how do you see us responding to that? Because we have so many from Haiti coming into the US. And also, I just want to add that working with UNA USA chapters from North Carolina through to Puerto Rico within the region where we've had a lot of disasters and near misses, we know that conflict can happen here over refugee displacements and food insecurities locally. I just request and ask that we all consider being very active on the local level. As you've brought up, thinking globally, acting locally, I think that our members need to be on the city and the county commission boards that help make decisions locally in terms of legislation that will support us with all of the UN global goals. Thank you so much. And the question regarding Haiti, it may be out of line, but when I saw your bio, I had to ask.
Great, great. Thank you.
And
Well-
thank you, James Shields, for inviting me.
Oh, you're wonderful.
Fantastic
So happy
chapter
to hear.
president and neighbor.
You're a true leader in this area. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for your comment. I don't want to do a long question on Haiti. Haiti to me is a tragedy. We keep on repeating the same mistakes, but so do the Haitians. But the biggest challenge there is that they are close to famine level, from what I've heard, and that's not a good situation. The rebuilding from the 2010 earthquake was never completed. The country lacks infrastructure. Something hopeful, I can tell you, I'm on the board of a small little group called Earth Spark International. Haiti does not have a national grid, and we've started these distributed energy projects in the south of Haiti, and actually giving women the ability to cook on these clean cook stoves, letting women have electricity that they can buy, like cell phone minutes in this community, all of which is solar and clean energy, may be a way forward, but it still needs a government, and Haiti's government, unfortunately, has always been plagued by all kinds of party deals and corruption. And I don't want to get into it and use the time in this meeting, but I've always felt every time we think we're going to have a great success, we see backward stepping. The only solution I can think of, since you mentioned community, Haitians in Florida have become a growing and important constituency politically. And I think the important thing for that community to do when they become US citizens is to register and vote and organize to get some clearer policies and support for their country.
Mhm. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Other questions? Too close to dinner, Jim. I think that's the problem. Everybody wants to go out and get that
St. Patrick's
green
Day.
beer. We want to go get that green beer today. Happy St. Patrick's Day to those celebrating.
This is Jim Mugan, and I'd like to ask you an appropriate St. Patrick's Day
Absolutely.
question about this. And, we, grew up learning about the Great Hunger in Ireland, in the 1840s, where it started with the failure of the potato crop, which was a subsequent, year after year, which was a staple in the diet, but really exacerbated by a country that, even at the doorstep of one of the wealthiest nations in the world, lost almost 1/8 of their population to hunger. And so what I'm wondering, and then that was a colonial power, and I'm wondering how much of that still goes on, where the country has an adequate food supply, but it's siphoned off. I know you mentioned that government and greed are some of the problems worldwide, but any place in particular where countries have an adequate food supply and are capable of supporting themselves, but politically their food is siphoned off from them?
It's hard to respond to that. To give you a specific example, I think as I said, there are 34 countries in the world that cannot produce enough food for them. That's a small number of countries. Where the food is siphoned off, China did that. Certainly the great famines that they've had are there. One thing we know about siphoning off food and famine is that famines don't occur in democratic countries.
Right.
And so you look back, Amartya Sen wrote this brilliant essay about on the famous famine in India during the colonial period in the 1940s, which was basically the beginning and the end of the British Empire in India, because it was truly a withholding, poorly managed food supply that created that. But the answer to your question is usually the only places you see this kind of withholding is in autocracies.
Right. And Venezuela, as you mentioned, a good example.
Venezuela doesn't have much food right now. Tragically, a country that could grow so much of its own food has squandered it. And they also have these food supply boxes that they get from Mexico. And that if you're a party member, you get one, but they've become fewer and more inadequate. So there's a real tragedy of food distribution. There's land to grow food in There's still food for very wealthy people, and there is food grown, but it's not accessible because people, remember what I said about the 4 elements of food. You have to have resources. If there's no employment, then you can't buy it, even if it's there.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
This is Betty Ann Starkey, and I would like to ask a question about your podcast.
Oh, well, the podcast is actually, that's not exactly the right name. We had a podcast that we started called Crisisability, which comes out, it's on Spotify. And it was with 2 other people, one person who used to be at Cargill and a food sustainability expert, and another person who wrote a book on the exponential era, and another guy, Steve Young. I can send you the link. I can put it in the chat. But we interviewed people about what opportunities were coming out of during this pandemic. And it's an interesting set of conversations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to see you.
And it looks like we have a question from David.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, Johanna.
Hi, David Arenberg. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. That was a great presentation, as always. You haven't
Well-
changed or aged a bit.
Well, and you look great on Morning Joe. For people who don't know who David Arenberg is, your state's attorney. Are you the county attorney now, or the?
It's state attorney.
State attorney.
It's Florida's version of district attorney. Yeah, it's for Palm Beach County.
And I can say that Dave was a White House fellow, and I was on the selection committee, and he's done great things. So this is nice to see you. Do you have a question, my friend?
Yeah, I do. I was curious, and I remember that the government of Zimbabwe had tried to remedy colonial rule by taking away the farms from the white colonialist farmers and give it to some of the local residents to try to become farmers, and it had become a disaster. Has that changed at all? Have they improved their lot? I haven't heard much about it in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't follow Zimbabwe closely, so I really don't know. The last time I was working on that was about 15 years ago. Taking away lands and redistribution has never been the immediate answer. It's always created, at the end of the day, terrible consequences, because you have to, with giving away land, compensate people, which we tend to believe is important. And I don't think there was any compensation. And I also feel that many of these small holders didn't have enough seed or resources from agricultural extension services to help them. Zimbabwe is a very rich country of the colonial period, and it's very similar to what happened in Venezuela, because it had so much wealth and just deteriorated. So it's, as I say, it's a much more complicated situation. There are some wonderful books by colleagues and scholars on Zimbabwe. If you're interested, I'll send it to you as a reference, but the situation is not great, let's put it that way, and lots of corruption.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Doug O'Connor. Thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful discussion. I'm wondering, inside the United States, like the east end of Long Island used to be all farms.
Right,
and
I remember Port
there are a
Jefferson
few.
potato farms.
And then you have a lot of corporations, like I know Bill Gates has a big farm now somewhere, and then like Central Florida, my mom is from Central Florida, and it's like when we were kids and we would visit her family, it was all orange groves, and now it's like all real estate.
Mhm.
Do you foresee any trouble in the future with American produce? I mean, it's like almost like a conflict of interest and population. More people are moving down to Florida than ever, and
Right.
and we're importing a lot of our food. Do you find trouble in this area, or?
I don't think there's a problem of importing food in the United States. We border Canada, we border Mexico. We get a lot of food from Canada, we get a lot of food from Mexico. A lot of our produce comes from Mexico through wonderful treaties that we have with the Mexican government. That's part of what I guess it's now called USMCA. So I don't find that too troubling. The problem that we had was the supply chains that were broken. And that is what needs to be fixed. When we are getting our blueberries and asparagus in the winter as a rich country from Peru, this is okay for us as a wealthy country, but what does it mean when you're in a poor country and you can't get access to nutritious food? You know, so in terms of Florida, all of this land that was farmland becoming real estate, that's a whole separate issue of what happened, especially before the economic crisis in 2007. But I suspect Florida still has the capacity to grow a lot of its food, even though land has decreased. I know strawberries we eat in the Northeast right now are all coming in from Florida, and so is corn. So I guess, oranges, by the way, come in from Brazil. We get a lot of our orange concentrate from Brazil. You can see if you go to any port, you'll see all these big tankers, and what are they pouring out? Concentrate of orange juice. So,
And do you have anything to say? I don't, it's almost like a conspiracy theory. Genetically modified food. Every now and you hear an article about that. What do you have any take on that?
I think it's not anything to be afraid of. And it's caused tremendous trade problems with the European Union and developing countries because of the GMO policy that the European Union has. There is no problem eating genetically modified food that I've understood, but it's become a big problem in the developing world because it's been held out as an evil. And we all eat genetically modified. Everything we eat in our life is genetically modified. You don't eat the corn that the ancestors in the Navajo ate. You eat corn that's been modified naturally. And genetic modification has improved on that, but it doesn't make you ill. It doesn't create, cells in your brain that are inferior, but I don't want to get started on that. I obviously find the GMO argument a hoax, and it really impacts trade in Europe. In the European countries that have problems selling, countries in the developing world cannot buy genetically modified products and then export them into Europe. That's part of the problem. So it impacts their ability to trade.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know if I explained that very clearly. It's a complex.
Good.
It was good. It was very good. Thank you.
Just to follow up, in terms of the genetically modified foods, at one time they were labeled here in the US, and then policy became that they no longer needed to be labeled. And as a consumer who does read labels, I just wonder why. And I think that sometimes sunshine is the best disinfectant. We see stories on television about tomatoes with DNA from fish, et cetera, and it kind of paints a picture abroad that's a little bit strange. So PR has a lot to do with it, just like the COVID shots, what's in them, and for the layperson, what does that mean for me and for my family? I do travel, taking groups internationally. I've led educational tours to over 100 countries, all 7 continents. I hear you. The last time I was in Zimbabwe, they were trading with the US dollar. They were handing out $1,000 bills from their own currency that we were using as souvenirs to bring home, and they're still struggling. But especially with food insecurity coming, and if in fact, the modifications with the food is going to help solve global hunger and starvation. I think a lot needs to be done with PR, and any comments or suggestions that you would make, I'd be open to hearing, because I agree with you, people can't starve. But on the other hand, how do we get them to understand that they need nutrition and that we're not killing them with chemicals and all kinds of conspiracy theories that we're seeing on the net on the regular.
Yeah, I think your comment is valid. There are some wonderful programs that USAID worked on in Africa. They modified corn, but they modified corn to put in more vitamin A Have you ever seen these orange corn stalks? They're a modified corn that gives people vitamin A because they don't get vegetables. So there's a lot of positive things that have gone on. A lot of it paid for by the US government, by the way, in terms of support for agricultural programs that people don't recognize. And it all has to do with nutrition. So yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation, and you're absolutely right.
We need good PR. Yeah, because when people hear genetically modified, they think of giant ears of corn that glow in the dark and things that we should not be consuming. So we need to make sure that we sell our agricultural products the way we sell our media streaming for entertainment.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of things we could do with better communication. We know that.
Great.
Any others? Jim, we're going to hold a question, or?
I
Well,
have a question. I have a question.
great.
Go
Can I
ahead.
go ahead?
Go ahead.
And I apologize for the lighting. I don't know what happened here, but anyway, thank you for giving us the picture of this. I'm a former professor of early childhood education and also a UN rep for an NGO, a children's organization. So as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about the 4-year-olds in my lab school and the kids that I've taught, and thinking how important it is to educate very young children that there are other kids who don't have what they have, and that they need to somehow take responsibility for caring and for making it different for other children. Not to put a guilt trip on the kids, but to put a love trip on the kids, you know, so that it's done out of love and not guilt, like you shouldn't be eating what you're eating because somebody is starving.
I don't know if you saw Michelle Obama's new show, this Mochi and Waffle, or Waffle and Mochi show, but
Nope.
that's exactly what she's been trying to do. And it's on Netflix. I've just watched a little bit. I haven't had a lot of time getting ready for this talk, but there was a very funny episode I did see where she was trying to teach Jimmy Kimmel's kids how to eat vegetables. So I thought you were going to ask me about stunting, which we don't have a problem with in the United States, but
No,
that
we
to
do.
me is, one of the greatest tragedies of all this starvation is
Yeah.
that you are losing generations of children in Africa and parts of Asia because, in the first 1,000 days, the absence of adequate nutrition is just deadly. And so you can give people all the food after that, but you've missed the brain developments part of it.
Yeah.
Lester Thoreau wrote a great book on the first 1,000 days. He'd be a good speaker, Jim, if you can get him, because the 1,000-day discussion and is, absolutely, to me, the big heartbreak of a lot of this.
Mhm.
Good. I was going to say, I see Sarah Stimson is here. Do you have any questions? Sorry to call on you. Or what about, I see Joe Denisi, do you have any questions?
Well, I do. Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I'm Joe Denisi. I produce documentaries for television. And my question is more of a sort of hypothetical or wish list, really. If you were queen of the world, how would you address world hunger?
Well, there would be multiple things I would do. And first, I would hope that you could have fewer autocratic states, because that would automatically mean that there'd be more equitable distribution of food. We don't recognize that women are the farmers of the world, even though people don't realize that. So supporting women farmers around the world who need not only seed, but fertilizer and access to market would be another thing. The global situation, and I think I had a slide or mentioned it, is that most countries can produce food. The challenge is that they don't have employment for people who don't have resources, who can't buy the food. You see that in Haiti. Someone was asking us about Haiti earlier. There's food in Haiti, but if you don't have money, you can't buy it. And I think that to me would be, to have more equitable distribution of wealth so people could afford what's there, because there's enough food in the world to go to 2050. There's no question we can produce it. We have the technology. The question is, can we, in the process, help change diets, end food waste? These are all my wish lists. I don't know if that answers you, but
Well, there's a lot of information there, and I
happy to
particularly
talk.
appreciate hearing about putting an emphasis on farmers.
Yeah, I
Well,
think there's
because
a whole story
I
there.
look for ways to think globally, act locally.
Yeah, there are lots of women farmers in the United States that I've met. I mean, the American Dairy Association, I went to a meeting and half the people in the room were women dairy farmers from the Northeast. And we don't realize that. But America's losing farmers now. We don't have many farmers left because of the agribusiness. But we are going to have to change the mode of production if we're going to have a sustainable food economy, because the earth can't take it with the carbon CO2 emissions.
Maybe another word on Joanna. Yeah, fantastic, thank you. But another word on trade. You mentioned trade, and I think of its importance when in the movement of peoples. When I first went to Honduras, Salvador, in the '60s, Honduras had a population not even 2 million. Now it's well over 8 million. So you can see a quadrupling of population just in my still young lifetime. And what does that mean? As you well know, it's urbanization there, urbanization in Brazil, wherever you are. And what you need when they come into the urban area are jobs. And I personally saw in Honduras, it's different now, but the production of so many jobs with CAFTA, so that you had assembly jobs. If you lose those, or if you lose the ability to export bananas, let's say, because of disasters, that's a severe problem, which leads to migration. But what about trade as a vital aspect? Because there's some restraints to trade, of course, are there?
In relationship to food security?
To food security, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, most countries do trade and they have agreements globally and with their neighbors, but trade is now a part of a global supply chain. So,
yeah,
I mean, so it's very hard when you're negotiating trade. Something that starts in Indonesia and winds up on your table is a very long supply chain, and it impacts thousands and thousands of jobs, both infrastructure, people working on the shipping of it, people working on the packing of it, people getting it to you. I think there's a big challenge now, and you know this, and this is, by the way, people don't know who asked, this is Ambassador Jim Cragen and his wife Gwen, who came in from San Antonio, Texas to visit.
That's right.
But I mean, I think it's a harder question because of the globalization of the value chains. And, that's where you have a problem. And no backup systems when something goes bad, whether it's from a natural disaster or from a man-made disaster, of which there are many as well. I mean, oil spills, for example, have tremendous impact on fishing industries. What do people do even in the Gulf when there's an oil spill? It totally destroys livelihoods. So we don't have that. Many countries don't have the safety net either that the United States has, of being able at least to help people. What's the safety net in Central America? Nothing. It's your family remittances that come from somebody who's working legally or illegally in the United States. So it's a much more complicated picture as far as I can tell. So it's a good question.
Thanks,
Thank you.
I'll have to think about it. Jim, anybody else?
Yeah, remittances are so important.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Johanna. Really enjoyed it. Outstanding.
Oh, hi. How are you?
Good, we're good. Thank you. Yeah.
Good, Sarah. Good to see you.
Very well done. Hi, Jim.
Thank you. Hi.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with everybody tonight. As I say, I'm interfering with St. Patrick's Day celebration. Certainly don't want to get in the way of somebody's beer. So, but anyway,
Johanna, thanks very much. It was really terrific.
oh, good. Well, as I say, anybody has questions, my email is on that PowerPoint, and I'm happy to answer by email to anybody who needs anything. But Jim, I can send it to you if people have it, and you have my contract. So we've just started the conversation as far as I can tell.
Right, yeah.
It's so
No,
much
it's been absolutely wonderful. I wish everybody in America were listening, because it's one of its most important problems. And we all need to think about it more, and somehow it should be part of what we're seeing on television and news programs and reading in newspapers and hearing politicians talk about. And so thank you for bringing this very important topic to our attention. We're coming close to the end of the program, and I want to thank you for coming, and you certainly have done an awful lot in your life to deal with this problem. And so thank you very, very much. I want to mention we give awards through our association. It's really to honor a former president who had been a longtime president, and it's a beautiful crystal award, and the person's name is inscribed on it, and it's for people who have made enormous contributions to scholarship and to practice in a field related to the United Nations. And so in person, I place it in your hands, but you'll get it in the mail. So
I graciously accept.
because you certainly deserve it. And before we conclude, we have had some donors who are mentioned in our flyers, the Robertsons, who give us some funding, and Natalie Grace Dejoux, and we want to thank them for doing this, because it's really, really important. And also we want to thank Jim Mugen and Casey Kohler, who have handled our digital side and made it work. I certainly wouldn't be able to do what they've done. And also that's been a great contribution. And so we really have, this is the fourth in a series of 4 lectures. One was on education, and one was on women's rights, and one was addiction, related. Food is one addiction, but there are others, smoking, gambling, etc. And tonight on food. And so it's been a very exciting series, and I hope you'll join us next year when we start in December with the series again. And in the meantime, please contact us. Email me or any people connected to here, and give us ideas. We hope next year we'll have in-person meetings. The Historical Society in West Palm Beach is willing to give us some space for our in-person programs, as well as the virtual programs. So, and all of you are here. There's some wonderful people here. Thank you for joining us. So have a happy St. Patrick's Day. That's about food too.
Right.
So thanks a lot. And thank you so much, Johanna. You're wonderful.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Good.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
It was
Thank you.
excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Hopefully.
All of you. Thank you.
See you
Thank you
all
for
in
coming.
person.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim, thank you and good night. I think I'll leave the meeting, and if you need anything or the address, I'll be happy to send it to you.
Good. And once I get organized, you'll hear from us with your reward and
Don't worry.
thank
don't
you
worry.
note, and because it was a wonderful program, and